I still remember the weight of that hotel room air. Chicago in October, the kind of damp chill that seeps through windows and settles into your bones. 23 floors up, the city hummed below me like a machine that never sleeps. All honking horns and distant sirens weaving through the glass and steel canyon. The curtains hung heavy and beige, blocking out most of the neon glow from the building across the street. I stood at the bathroom mirror, straightening a tie I'd worn to 9 consecutive conferences. Navy blue with thin silver stripes, chosen because it went with everything and offended no one. My reflection looked tired in the harsh fluorescent light. 41 years old and feeling every minute of it. I ran my fingers under my eyes, trying to erase the evidence of another sleepless night. Another night spent staring at hotel ceiling tiles while my mind wandered down paths I'd spent years learning to avoid. The conference badge on the desk read Julian Lawrence, Senior Software Engineer, same as always. 9 years of the same routine, the same presentations about database optimization and cloud migration strategies, the same networking dinners where I smiled and shook hands and pretended I belonged there. I'd perfected the art of professional invisibility, of being present without really being seen. But this year felt different somehow. Heavier. Like something was waiting just beyond the edge of my carefully constructed routine. Next to the badge sat an envelope, cream-colored and slightly bent from years of being carried and forgotten, tucked into briefcases and laptop bags, moving from hotel room to hotel room like a guilty secret. I'd pulled the photograph halfway out before losing my nerve again, the way I had a dozen times before. In it, 2 young men squinted against summer sunlight, arms slung carelessly around each other's shoulders on what looked like a college campus. Trees in full bloom behind them, books scattered on the grass at their feet. The boy on the left was me at 22, grinning with a kind of fearless joy I barely recognized anymore. My hair was longer then, unkempt in that deliberate way young men think looks effortless. The other was someone I'd spent 15 years trying not to think about, someone whose name I could still hear in my own voice, clear as the day I first spoke it. I slid the photo back into its hiding place, my hands trembling slightly as I tucked the envelope deep into my briefcase, buried beneath conference programs and business cards I'd never use. I turned the lock with more force than necessary, the metallic click echoing in the quiet room. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some memories are safer left undisturbed. The company dinner started like they always do. 40 people crammed around tables that seat 35, everyone talking too loud over the restaurant's ambient jazz, voices competing with the clink of wine glasses and the distant sizzle from the open kitchen. I found my usual spot near the back, close enough to participate when someone addressed me directly, but far enough to disappear when the conversation turned to weekend plans or family stories I couldn't genuinely contribute to. The wine was decent, something red and forgettable. The conversation was safe, revolving around quarterly reports and industry trends, the kind of professional small talk that filled time without requiring anyone to reveal anything real about themselves. Everything proceeded exactly as expected until someone's phone came out. These moments always felt inevitable, like gravity pulling a group of people toward collective documentation. Sarah from marketing stood up, waving her device like a conductor's baton, her voice cutting through the dinner chatter. She insisted we needed a group photo for the company newsletter, something about team building and corporate culture. Phones materialized from pockets and purses like magic tricks. A waiter was summoned and handed someone's iPhone, looking slightly bewildered by his sudden promotion to photographer. People began clustering together, shifting and rearranging themselves into something that might look spontaneous if you didn't know better. Arms draped over shoulders, heads tilted at calculated angles, everyone trying to find their most flattering position while pretending not to care how they looked. Someone called my name from across the crowded group. Julian, scooting closer. I moved reluctantly toward the cluster of people, already calculating my escape route for when the camera clicked, already planning how quickly I could slip away afterward. But as I leaned into the frame, wedging myself between a marketing coordinator and someone from accounting, something shifted. A shoulder pressed against mine, solid and warm through expensive fabric. The contact sent electricity down my arm, a recognition that bypassed my brain entirely and went straight to some deeper, more primitive part of my nervous system. Laughter, soft and familiar, brushed past my ear like a whisper from another life. Another version of myself I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself he'd never existed. I turned my head just slightly, maybe an inch, maybe less, and the world tilted on its axis. Emory. He was right there, close enough that I could count the few gray threads in his dark hair, could smell his cologne cutting through the restaurant's blend of garlic and wine and too many people in too small a space. It was the same scent he'd worn in college, something woody and clean that I'd once known as well as my own reflection. His face was older now, more angular, the soft roundness of youth carved away by 15 years of living. But those eyes were exactly the same. Dark brown with flecks of gold that caught light like amber, the kind of eyes that seemed to hold secrets and promises in equal measure. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decode, something that flickered between surprise and recognition and maybe, just maybe, the same breathless disbelief that was currently short-circuiting my ability to think coherently. Time seemed to stretch and condense simultaneously, the restaurant noise fading to a dull murmur as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. The photographer called for everyone to smile, his voice cutting through my paralysis like a distant alarm clock. I felt Emory's cheek brush against mine as we both turned toward the camera, the contact so light it might have been accidental if not for the way he leaned into it. Just barely. Just enough to let me know it was intentional. His skin was warm and slightly rough with the beginning of evening stubble. The touch was electric, familiar, impossible. It carried the weight of every memory I'd tried to forget, every conversation we'd never finished, every goodbye we'd never said. He didn't pull away. The camera flash went off like lightning, freezing us in that moment of contact. But still he remained close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck, could sense the slight tremor in his shoulder that told me he was as shaken by this collision of past and present as I was. For one stretched moment that felt like falling and flying simultaneously, neither did I. We stood there, suspended in amber, while the rest of the world continued to move around us. People began to disperse, chattering about how they hoped they looked good, how someone would email everyone the photo later, how they needed to get back to their hotels because tomorrow's keynote started early. The familiar ritual of group dispersal played out around us, but I remained frozen in that space where past and present had suddenly, devastatingly collided. Emory hadn't moved either. We stood there, two men in expensive suits, surrounded by colleagues and strangers who had no idea they'd just witnessed the moment my carefully constructed life began to crack at its foundation, sharing a silence that contained 15 years of unfinished conversations and the terrible, wonderful recognition that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The flight home from Chicago was delayed by 2 hours, giving me more time to sit in those uncomfortable terminal chairs and replay that moment over and over. Emory's face in the restaurant light, the way he'd said my name, soft and questioning, as if he wasn't sure I was real. We'd exchanged a few awkward words after the photo, professional pleasantries that carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. He'd handed me his business card with fingers that barely touched mine, but the contact still sent electricity up my arm. Creative director, the card read. Still in Seattle. Still making beautiful things. By the time I pulled into my driveway in suburban Indiana, it was past midnight. The house stood before me in the darkness, a beige two-story colonial that looked exactly like every other house on Maple Street. Perfectly manicured lawn, matching shutters, a decorative wreath on the front door that Clara changed with the seasons. Everything in its place, everything as it should be. I sat in the car for a moment before going inside, engine ticking as it cooled, watching the automatic porch light cast its familiar yellow glow across the walkway I'd traveled thousands of times. This was my life. This house, this street, this careful arrangement of normalcy I'd built brick by brick over the past 15 years. It was good. It was stable. It was everything I was supposed to want. So why did it feel like I was looking at it through glass? Inside, the house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft whisper of the heating system. Family photos lined the hallway walls in perfect rows, documenting years of birthdays and holidays and school events. There was Clara at our wedding, radiant in white lace, her hand resting on my chest as we danced. There were the girls as babies, as toddlers, gap-toothed and grinning in their school pictures. Summer trips to Lake Michigan, where we all wore matching blue shirts and forced smiles for whoever was holding the camera that year. I climbed the stairs quietly, avoiding the third step that always creaked. Clara was asleep on her side of the bed, her phone still charging on the nightstand, probably having fallen asleep scrolling through social media again. Even in sleep, her face held a slight tension, the kind that comes from managing a household and 2 children and a husband who increasingly felt like a polite stranger living in her guest room. Morning came at 5:30, same as always. My body woke without an alarm clock, trained by years of routine that had become as automatic as breathing. I slipped into my running clothes in the dark, kissed Clara's forehead without waking her, and stepped out into the pre-dawn stillness of our neighborhood. The route was always the same. Left on Maple, right on Oak, straight for 2 miles to the park and back. My feet knew every crack in the sidewalk, every slight incline and dip. Other early risers nodded as they passed, fellow members of the Dawn Patrol who understood that these quiet miles were sometimes the only peace we'd find all day. I used to love this time, the solitude and the steady rhythm of breathing and footfall. But lately, the rhythm felt more like a metronome marking time until something I couldn't name. Back home, I showered and dressed while Clara got the girls ready for school. Our conversations were efficient, practiced, covering logistics with the precision of air traffic controllers. Who would pick up Nora from piano? Whether Emma needed money for the field trip. What time my conference call ended so I could handle dinner if Clara was running late from her book club. We moved around each other in the kitchen like dancers who'd rehearsed the same routine for years, never quite touching, never quite colliding. She handed me coffee in the blue mug she'd bought for my birthday 3 years ago. I kissed her cheek and told her I'd see her tonight. She scrolled through her phone while I buttered toast for the girls, already mentally organizing her day while mine stretched ahead with the familiar weight of meetings and deadlines and the small, steady satisfactions of solving problems that had clear solutions. At work, I was Julian Lawrence, senior software engineer, the man who could untangle any database issue, who arrived early and stayed late and never missed a deadline. My colleagues respected me. My boss valued my reliability. I had a corner office with a view of the parking lot and framed certificates on the wall that proved I was qualified to do exactly what I'd been doing for the past 12 years. But increasingly, I found myself standing at my office window during lunch breaks, watching people walk to their cars, wondering what it would feel like to just keep walking. To get in my car and drive until I reached somewhere I'd never been, someone I'd never been. The feeling followed me home most evenings, a restlessness that had no name and no clear solution. After dinner, after homework was checked and dishes were loaded and the girls were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, I often found myself in the garage. Officially, I was organizing tools or checking on the lawnmower, but really I was just standing there with my hands in my pockets, watching the light from the house pool under the door crack, listening to the muffled sounds of Clara watching television in the living room. It felt like waiting, though I couldn't have said for what. At night, when the house was finally quiet and Clara was asleep beside me, my mind would drift to places I'd trained it not to go. College dreams came in fragments, vivid and disjointed. Seattle rain on dorm room windows. A boy with a camera who laughed like music and saw beauty in things other people overlooked. Late nights in coffee shops that stayed open until dawn, talking about books and movies and the future we were so certain we could shape with our bare hands. His name was a word I'd stopped saying out loud 15 years ago, but in dreams, I could still hear my own voice speaking it with the kind of tenderness I'd almost forgotten I was capable of. Emory. The way it felt on my tongue, familiar as my own name. The way he'd smile when I said it, like I'd given him something precious. Those dreams always ended the same way. Him leaving. Me standing in a doorway, watching him walk away with a suitcase and a plane ticket to somewhere I couldn't follow. Not because he didn't ask me to come, but because I was too afraid to say yes. Too afraid of what it would mean to choose love over safety, possibility over certainty. I'd wake with my heart racing, the taste of regret sharp in my mouth, Clara's steady breathing beside me a reminder of the life I'd chosen instead. The good life. The right life. The life that made sense on paper and in Christmas cards and in conversations with neighbors who nodded approvingly when I mentioned my job, my house, my family. But lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my perfectly ordinary bedroom in my perfectly ordinary house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd built my entire existence around the shape of something missing. Like a sculpture carved around an absence, beautiful from a distance but hollow at its core. And now, after one moment in a Chicago restaurant, that absence had a name again. The text came 3 days later, just as I was settling into the familiar rhythm of pretending Chicago had never happened. I was in my office, staring at lines of code that might as well have been hieroglyphics for all the sense they were making, when my phone buzzed against the desk. Unknown number, but I recognized the words immediately. "Hey, Julian. This is Emory. Got your number from the conference directory. Hope that's okay." My hands were shaking as I read it. Then read it again. Then set the phone down and tried to focus on my monitor, but the cursor just blinked at me accusingly while my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I didn't respond for 2 hours. Told myself I was being professional, finishing the database optimization I'd been working on before the interruption. But really, I was terrified. Terrified of what responding might mean, what door it might open that I'd spent 15 years learning to keep closed. Finally, I typed back, "Hi? Yes, that's fine. How are you?" His response came within minutes, as if he'd been waiting. "I'm good. Still processing seeing you the other night. Would you like to get a drink? I'm back in Chicago until Friday." I stared at those words until they blurred. A drink. Such a simple thing. People got drinks all the time, old friends catching up, former colleagues comparing notes about how life had turned out. Nothing complicated about it. Nothing that had to mean more than two people sharing a beer and some conversation. Except it did mean more. We both knew it did. I told Clara I had to go back to Chicago for a follow-up meeting. A client issue that needed handling in person. She barely looked up from her laptop when I said it, just nodded, and asked if I'd be back in time for Emma's soccer game on Saturday. The lie came so easily it scared me. The hotel bar was on the 10th floor, all floor-to-ceiling windows and dim lighting designed to make everyone look mysterious and important. I arrived 15 minutes early, partly from habit and partly because I needed time to compose myself, to remember how to breathe normally. The view stretched across the city, lights beginning to twinkle as evening settled over Chicago like a familiar blanket. I was nursing a whiskey when I saw him walk in, scanning the room until his eyes found mine. He moved differently now, with more assurance, less of the restless energy that had defined him in college. Success looked good on him. The years had carved away some of the softness from his face, leaving behind sharp cheekbones and laugh lines that suggested he'd found reasons to smile in the decade and a half since we'd last spoken. He ordered something complicated, a cocktail with ingredients I'd never heard of, and settled into the chair across from me like we did this every week. Like no time had passed at all. We talked about safe things first. His work as a creative director, the freelance life that kept him traveling between Seattle and Portland and San Francisco. He'd never married. He mentioned casually, as if it was just another piece of biographical information and not something that made my chest tighten with emotions I had no right to feel. He asked about my family, and I found myself describing Clara and the girls like characters in someone else's story, people I knew well but wasn't quite connected to. The conversation flowed easier than it should have. We fell back into old rhythms, finishing each other's thoughts, laughing at the same moments. He told me about a project he'd worked on, designing album covers for a band I'd actually heard of, and I could see that same creative spark in his eyes that had drawn me to him 20 years ago. The way he saw beauty in unexpected places, patterns in chaos, stories in the space between words. But underneath the easy familiarity, there was something else. A current of recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the way his fingers drummed against his glass, the way he leaned forward when he talked, the way his eyes kept finding mine across the small table between us. Like he was checking to make sure I was really there, really listening, really the same person he'd once known better than anyone. We talked about Seattle, about mutual friends who'd scattered across the country like seeds on the wind. Some had married, some had children, some had changed careers entirely. A few had achieved the dreams we'd all talked about in college coffee shops at 2 in the morning. Most had settled into lives that were good enough, comfortable enough, safe enough. When he mentioned the photography program he'd almost enrolled in but didn't, I remembered the camera he'd carried everywhere, the way he'd photograph shadows on brick walls and strangers reading in parks, and me, always me, when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I'd found those photos years later, when I was packing to move away from Seattle, tucked inside a book he'd left behind. Pictures of me laughing, sleeping, concentrating on homework, existing in moments I hadn't known were being preserved. I'd kept them, even though I shouldn't have. They were probably still buried somewhere in my desk drawer at home, behind insurance papers and old tax returns, like evidence of a crime I couldn't quite bring myself to destroy. The bar grew crowded around us, filled with conference attendees and business travelers, people conducting deals and celebrations and breakups over expensive drinks. But our corner felt separate from all of that, like we were sitting in a bubble where only our voices mattered, where the rest of the world had faded to background noise. When he pulled out his phone and suggested we take a selfie, my entire body went rigid. "Just for old time's sake," he said, smiling that same crooked smile that had undone me 2 decades ago. Something to remember this by. I should have said no. Should have made an excuse about bad lighting, or looking tired, or not being photogenic. Instead, I found myself leaning across the small table as he held up his phone, angling it to capture both our faces in the frame. Our cheeks touched, just barely, the same way they had in the restaurant 3 days ago. But this time, there was no crowd around us, no photographer calling for us to smile, no excuse for the contact except the simple fact that we both wanted it. His skin was warm and slightly rough with evening stubble. He smelled like that same cologne and something else, something that was just him, familiar as my own reflection. The phone clicked, but he didn't pull away. Neither did I. For a moment that stretched like taffy, we stayed there, faces touching, breathing the same air, existing in the space between then and now, between what was and what might still be possible. I could feel his pulse against my temple, could sense the slight tremor in his hand that told me he was as affected by this as I was. When we finally separated, when he lowered the phone and we sat back in our respective chairs, something had shifted between us. The careful distance we'd maintained all evening had collapsed, leaving behind a raw honesty that made it hard to look directly at each other. He showed me the photo on his phone screen. 2 men in their 40s, faces close together, both looking slightly stunned by their own proximity. You could see it in our eyes, the recognition of something that had never really ended, only been buried beneath years of sensible choices and careful living. That's when I knew I was in trouble. Real trouble. The kind that couldn't be solved with logic or good intentions or reminders about the life I'd built, the promises I'd made, the person I was supposed to be. Because looking at that photo, seeing the way we fit together even after all these years, I realized that some doors, once cracked open, can never be fully closed again. The first text was innocent enough. I sent it 3 days after Chicago, a link to a podcast about design thinking that I thought he might find interesting. His response came within an hour. "Thanks for this. Always knew you had good taste." That simple exchange opened something I hadn't meant to unlock. Within a week, we were messaging daily. Brief things at first, a joke about the terrible conference coffee, a photo of a sunset from his latest client trip to Portland, my observation about how nothing in Indiana was quite the right color. But gradually, the messages grew longer, more personal, arriving at hours when I should have been asleep beside my wife instead of staring at my phone in the darkness of our bedroom. At home, The carefully maintained rhythm of our family life began to develop small fractures. I forgot to pick up the dry cleaning. Missed a PTA meeting that had been on the calendar for weeks. When Emma asked if I was mad about something, her 8-year-old face creased with the kind of worry children shouldn't have to carry. I knelt down and assured her I was just tired. Work stress? I said, nothing for her to worry about. But Clara noticed. She always noticed. The way I checked my phone more frequently, the distant look in my eyes during dinner conversations, how I'd started taking longer routes home from work, as if I was reluctant to arrive. She didn't ask directly, not yet, but I could feel her watching me with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The memories started returning without warning, vivid fragments that would surface at the most ordinary moments. I'd be brushing my teeth and suddenly remember the used bookstore where Emory and I had spent entire afternoons, him photographing the way light fell across dusty spines while I read passages aloud from books we couldn't afford to buy. I'd be sitting in a meeting and find myself thinking about the morning after our first night together, how he'd traced the line of my shoulder with one finger while I pretended to still be asleep, both of us too nervous to acknowledge what had shifted between us in the darkness. The letter I'd never sent came back to me in pieces. I'd written it the night before graduation, pages of words trying to explain why I couldn't follow him to the photography program in San Francisco, why I'd accepted the software position in Chicago instead. The letter that had ended with me saying I loved him, but not enough to risk everything, not enough to choose uncertainty over the security I'd been taught to value above all else. I'd found it years later in an old textbook, still sealed in an envelope with his name written in my careful handwriting, and burned it in the sink of my first apartment like I was destroying evidence of a crime. The day he left haunted me most of all. How he'd stood in the doorway of my dorm room with a duffel bag and a plane ticket, asking one last time if I was sure about my choice. How I'd said yes, even though every cell in my body was screaming no. How he'd nodded and kissed my forehead and walked away without looking back, because he was braver than I was, because he understood that clean breaks heal better than prolonged agony. 2 weeks after our Chicago reunion, he texted me from Seattle. I'm going to be in your part of the world next month. Client meeting in Indianapolis. Any chance you'd want to meet halfway? I stared at that message for 20 minutes before responding. I told Clara I had a lunch meeting with a vendor, another lie that came easier than it should have. We arranged to meet at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, in the sculpture park where we could walk and talk without the intensity of sitting across from each other at a table. November in Indiana was gray and bitter, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and settles there. The sculpture park was nearly empty except for a few dedicated joggers and a woman walking a small dog that seemed unimpressed by the artistic significance of its surroundings. Emory was waiting by the entrance when I arrived, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a black wool coat that made him look like he belonged in one of those coffee table books about stylish people living interesting lives. We walked the winding paths between abstract installations and classical figures, our breath visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the dry air. Conversation came easier outdoors, without walls to contain it, without the pressure of direct eye contact. We talked about his current project, designing visual identity for a startup that wanted to revolutionize something I didn't entirely understand. I told him about a database migration I was leading, making it sound more interesting than it was because I wanted to seem like I'd done something worthwhile with the past 15 years. When we stopped at a coffee cart near the museum building, there was only one cup left of the dark roast we both preferred. The vendor apologized, offered to brew a fresh pot, but Emory waved him off and ordered it anyway. We'll share, he said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. We found a bench facing a sculpture that looked like two figures reaching toward each other across an impossible distance. The coffee was strong and bitter, warming my hands through the paper cup. When I handed it to Emory, our fingers brushed for just a moment, that same electric recognition I'd felt in Chicago. He took a sip and passed it back, his eyes never leaving my face. You used to touch my face when you laughed, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant traffic. Do you remember that? I did remember. Suddenly, completely, like a door opening in my mind. 20 years old and drunk on possibility. Sitting in his dorm room while he developed photos in the makeshift darkroom he'd created in his closet. The way he'd say something that struck me as impossibly clever or funny or beautiful, and I'd reach out without thinking, my palm against his cheek, my thumb tracing the line of his jaw while I laughed with the kind of pure joy I'd almost forgotten I was capable of. The memory hit me with physical force, so vivid I could almost smell the chemical developer, could almost hear the music he used to play while he worked. I swallowed hard, the coffee suddenly tasteless in my mouth. I remember, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. He leaned closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the same ones that had captivated me 2 decades ago. His hand moved toward my face, hesitated for a moment in the space between us, then settled against my cheek with the same gentle certainty I remembered from a lifetime ago. I closed my eyes and let myself feel it. The warmth of his palm, the slight callus on his thumb from years of working with cameras and computer mice, the way he cupped my face like I was something precious that might break if he wasn't careful. For a moment, sitting on that bench in the cold Indianapolis air, I wasn't a 41-year-old man with a mortgage and responsibilities and a life that made sense on paper. I was just Julian, young and in love and brave enough to believe that feeling this way about someone was worth any risk. When I opened my eyes, he was watching me with an expression that held 20 years of questions and possibilities and regrets. The sculpture in front of us seemed to shimmer in the gray light, those two figures still reaching for each other, still frozen in the space between connection and separation. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I was no longer willing to be the one who stayed safely on his side of that distance. The lie came to me fully formed, as if my subconscious had been crafting it for weeks. I told Clara I needed a weekend away for a writing retreat, something about documenting technical processes for the company manual. She looked up from her laptop with mild surprise. I'd never shown interest in writing before, but nodded absently and asked if I needed her to handle the girls' activities on Saturday. The ease with which she accepted my fabrication should have made me feel guilty. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something I'd been trying not to acknowledge for years. We were living parallel lives in the same house, orbiting each other with practiced efficiency, but rarely colliding in any meaningful way. She didn't question my sudden need for solitude because she'd long ago stopped being curious about the inner workings of my mind. I found the Airbnb online, a small cabin an hour north of Indianapolis, tucked into woods that promised privacy and quiet. The photos showed rough-hewn beams and a stone fireplace, the kind of place where city people went to remember what silence sounded like. I booked it for 2 nights and sent Emory the address without explanation. He responded with a simple thumbs-up emoji, as if we did this sort of thing all the time. The cabin was exactly as advertised, rustic without being primitive, isolated without being inaccessible. I arrived first and stood on the small front porch, breathing air that smelled of pine and approaching winter, listening to the absence of traffic and sirens and all the white noise that filled my days. When Emory's rental car pulled up the gravel drive 20 minutes later, my heart began beating so hard I wondered if he could hear it from across the clearing. He got out slowly, taking in the setting with the same careful attention he'd once paid to potential photographs. Still cataloging beauty, still seeing things the rest of us missed. He carried a small overnight bag and a bottle of wine, holding both like peace offerings as he approached the porch where I stood trying to remember how to breathe normally. We spent the afternoon carefully, like people handling something fragile. We built a fire because the cabin was cold and because it gave us something to do with our hands. We opened the wine because it was good wine and because the silence between us needed something to soften its edges. We talked about neutral things, his latest project, my daughter's upcoming school performances, the way the light fell through the pine branches outside the kitchen window. But underneath every conversation was another conversation, the one we weren't having about why we were here, what this weekend meant, what we thought might happen in this place removed from our ordinary lives. The air between us hummed with possibility and restraint in equal measure. For dinner, we drove to a small-town diner where the waitress called everyone honey, and the coffee came in heavy white mugs that had seen decades of use. We sat across from each other in a red vinyl booth, and for the first time all day, the careful distance we'd maintained began to crack. Maybe it was the wine from earlier, or the way the fluorescent lights made everything feel slightly unreal. But we started talking about college with a frankness we'd avoided in Chicago and Indianapolis. He told me about the photography program in San Francisco, how he'd thrown himself into it with manic intensity those first few months, staying up until dawn in darkrooms, developing roll after roll of film as if he could print his way past the loneliness. How he'd dated other people, nice people, creative people, but how none of them had ever quite fit the space I'd left behind. I told him about meeting Clara, about the relief of finding someone who didn't ask complicated questions about my past, who was content with the version of myself I was willing to share. How I convinced myself that the hollow feeling in my chest was just part of growing up, that everyone learned to live with some essential disappointment about how their life had turned out. By the time we returned to the cabin, full dark had settled over the woods. The temperature had dropped enough that our breath was visible in small puffs, and Emory suggested we take a walk before going inside. The idea seemed both reasonable and dangerous, but I found myself nodding, pulling on my jacket, following him down a path that led deeper into the trees. We walked without speaking, our footsteps muffled by fallen leaves, the occasional crack of a twig the only sound besides our breathing and the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. The path wound between tall pines and bare hardwoods, lit only by scattered patches of moonlight that filtered through the canopy above. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when the first drops began to fall. Just a few at first, barely noticeable, then more steadily as the clouds that had been gathering all evening finally opened. We should have turned back immediately, should have hurried toward the warmth and dryness of the cabin, but instead we found ourselves laughing at the suddenness of it, the way the rain seemed to come from everywhere at once. By the time we reached the cabin porch, we were both soaked through, our clothes clinging and hair dripping, shivering but still laughing with the giddy relief of people who'd been caught in something they couldn't control. We collapsed into the two wooden chairs that faced out toward the woods, not caring that we were getting them wet, not caring that we should go inside and change into dry clothes. The rain drummed against the cabin roof with increasing intensity, creating a curtain of sound that seemed to separate us from the rest of the world. I was saying something about how we should probably go inside before we caught pneumonia, something practical and sensible, when I turned toward Emory and found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His hair was plastered against his forehead, droplets of water tracing paths down his cheeks, and without thinking, without planning, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from my face. His fingers lingered against my skin, warm despite the rain, and I went very still. It wasn't a kiss. Not yet. But it felt like the moment before a kiss, the pause between intention and action where everything hangs in balance. His thumb traced the line of my cheekbone, the same gesture I remembered from 20 years ago, and I realized that this was the moment we'd never gotten to finish back then. The conversation that had been interrupted by fear and circumstance, and all the ways we'd been too young to know what we were risking. I didn't move away. Couldn't move away. His hand curved against my face like it belonged there, like it had been waiting 20 years to return to this exact position. The rain continued to fall around us, but all I could focus on was the warmth of his palm, the way his eyes searched mine as if looking for permission or absolution or just the simple confirmation that this was real. Neither of us spoke. Words would have broken whatever spell was holding us in this moment, would have forced us to acknowledge what was happening and decide whether to let it continue. Instead, we sat there in the rain, his hand on my face, my heart beating so loud I was sure he could hear it over the storm. When we finally went inside, our clothes heavy with water, our shoes squelching against the hardwood floor, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and stopped. The man looking back at me was someone I almost recognized, hair disheveled, eyes bright with something that might have been fear or joy or both, shirt clinging to a body that suddenly felt like it belonged to me again instead of to Julian the husband, Julian the father, Julian the reliable software engineer. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't looking at the reflection of who I was supposed to be. I was looking at who I actually was, who I'd always been underneath all the careful construction and good intentions. A man who'd spent half his life lying to himself about what he needed, what he wanted, who he loved. Standing there in my damp clothes, water still dripping from my hair, I finally stopped running from the truth that had been waiting patiently for me to acknowledge it. Some recognition couldn't be buried forever. Some doors, once opened, changed the architecture of everything around them. The drive home from the cabin took 90 minutes, but it felt like crossing between two different planets. With each mile, I could feel the weight of my ordinary life settling back onto my shoulders like a coat I'd forgotten I was wearing. The suburban streets of my neighborhood appeared exactly as I'd left them. Neat lawns, matching mailboxes, the comfortable predictability of a place where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. I sat in my driveway for several minutes before going inside, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to reconcile the man who'd spent the weekend in the woods with the one who was about to walk through that front door and resume the role of husband and father. The house looked the same as always, warm lights spilling from the kitchen window, Clara's car parked in its usual spot, everything in its designated place. But something fundamental had shifted inside me, something that couldn't be hidden or ignored or wished away. The recognition I'd found in that bathroom mirror was still there, reflecting back at me from the rearview mirror, refusing to be dismissed as a momentary lapse in judgment. Inside, the house hummed with its familiar rhythm. The dishwasher churning through its cycle, our old dog Max curled beneath the kitchen table, the hallway nightlight flickering in that way I'd been meaning to fix for months. Clara was at her laptop, probably responding to work emails or planning the week ahead, her reading glasses perched on her nose in a way that made her look older than her 39 years. She looked up when I walked in, offering the same mild smile she always did when I returned from business trips. "How was the writing retreat?" she asked, closing the laptop with the careful attention of someone who was genuinely interested in my answer. The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I could have lied again, could have invented details about documentation and technical writing, could have slipped back into the comfortable fiction we'd been living for years. Instead, I found myself standing there in our kitchen, still holding my overnight bag, unable to form words that felt anything other than false. She studied my face with the kind of attention I hadn't felt from her in years, really looking at me instead of just checking that I was present and accounted for. Something shifted in her expression, a recognition that bypassed language entirely and went straight to the part of her that had once known me well enough to sense when something was wrong. The silence stretched between us, filled with the soft sounds of our house settling around us, the distant hum of suburban evening life. She set her laptop aside and folded her hands on the table, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned not to rush important conversations. "Julian," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the accusation I'd been dreading. "Is there someone else?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so precisely the right question asked in exactly the wrong way. I opened my mouth to deny it, to explain that it wasn't what she thought, that nothing had happened, that I'd never meant for any of this to unfold the way it had. But the words wouldn't come, because sitting there in our kitchen, under the same light where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations and comfortable silences, I realized I couldn't lie to her anymore. Couldn't lie to myself anymore. Whatever was happening with Emory, whatever had been reawakened in me over the past few weeks, it was bigger than an affair or a midlife crisis or any of the simple explanations that might have made this easier to categorize and dismiss. "It's not what you think," I finally managed, the words coming out rougher than I'd intended. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, like someone else was speaking through me. She nodded slowly, as if my non-answer had confirmed something she'd already suspected. Her hands remained folded on the table, steady and calm. while mine shook slightly as I set down my bag and pulled out the chair across from her. "Is it someone you used to be?" she asked, and those 7 words broke something inside me that I hadn't realized was still intact. The precision of her question, the way she'd cut straight through to the heart of what I'd been struggling to understand myself, shattered whatever composure I'd been trying to maintain. Because she was right. It wasn't about someone else in the way she'd probably meant it. It was about someone else I had been, someone I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself he'd never existed. Tears came then, the kind that start as a burning behind your eyes and build until they can't be contained any longer. I put my head in my hands and cried for the 22-year-old who'd been too afraid to follow love across the country, for the years I'd spent building a life around the shape of that absence, for the woman sitting across from me who'd never known she was married to half a person. Clara didn't move to comfort me, didn't reach across the table or offer empty reassurances. She just sat there and witnessed my breakdown with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything, waiting for me to find words for what we both already knew. "I'm sorry," I said when I could finally speak again, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what I was apologizing for. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought I could just forget." We talked until nearly 3 in the morning, sitting at that kitchen table while the house grew quiet around us. She asked questions with the careful precision of someone gathering information rather than assigning blame. When had I known? How long had I been lying to myself? To her? Did I love her at all? Or had I just been playing a role I thought I was supposed to fill? Some of her questions I could answer. Others left me staring at my hands, trying to untangle 15 years of self-deception and good intentions gone wrong. Yes, I loved her, but not in the way she deserved to be loved. Yes, I'd been playing a role, but I genuinely believed it was who I was supposed to become. Yes, I'd known, somewhere deep down, but I'd been too afraid to let that knowledge surface until it was too late to choose differently, without destroying everything we'd built together. When we finally went to bed, we lay on opposite sides of the mattress like strangers, the space between us feeling wider than it ever had. I listened to her breathing gradually slow and deepen, but sleep wouldn't come for me. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what came next, how you dismantle a life you've spent 15 years constructing when there are children involved, when there are mortgages and school districts, and all the practical considerations that make clean breaks impossible. Eventually, I gave up on sleep and made my way to the garage, pulling on a jacket over my pajamas, stepping into the cold November air that smelled of fallen leaves and approaching winter. I sat in one of the lawn chairs we'd stored there for the season, my phone heavy in my hands, thumb hovering over Emory's contact information. I typed and deleted a dozen messages, each one feeling either too much or too little, too desperate or too casual for what I needed to say. Finally, I gave up on texting and just called him, not caring that it was nearly 4 in the morning, not caring about time zones or appropriateness or any of the considerations that would have mattered in my old life. He answered on the second ring, voice alert despite the hour, as if he'd been waiting for this call. I told her, I said without preamble, my voice barely above a whisper in the darkness of the garage. I couldn't lie anymore. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard him exhale slowly, a sound that carried relief and sadness and something that might have been hope. "Okay," he said simply. "What happens now?" And for the first time in 15 years, I found myself answering with complete honesty, "I don't know, but I'm ready to find out." 1 month later, I placed 2 mugs on the small wooden table that came with the cottage, steam rising from the coffee in lazy spirals that catch the morning light filtering through windows I haven't yet hung curtains over. The room is spare, almost monastic in its simplicity. A few unpacked boxes sit against the far wall, contents I'm still deciding whether I need or can finally let go of. Books mostly. Some kitchen items Clara insisted I take. A lamp my mother gave me years ago that has followed me through 3 different lives now. The cottage sits at the edge of a small lake about an hour north of Indianapolis, far enough from my old life to feel like genuine distance, but close enough that Emma and Nora can visit on weekends. It's not much, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that barely qualifies as such, but the rent is manageable on my reduced income, and the view of the water changes throughout the day in ways that remind me why Emory always carries a camera. On the mantel above the fireplace sit 2 photographs. The first shows me with my daughters from last month, all 3 of us grinning despite the circumstances, taken during our first overnight visit here. Nora had declared the cottage like a fairy tale house, while Emma, ever practical, had asked if I was sure the heating worked properly. Their resilience continues to amaze me. The way children can adapt to new configurations of love and family with a flexibility adults seem to lose somewhere along the way. Beside it sits the Selfie from the hotel bar in Chicago, the one Emory took that night when everything began to shift. 2 men in their 40s, faces close together, both looking slightly stunned by their own proximity. I'd printed it from his phone during one of his visits here, needing something tangible to mark the moment when I stopped running from myself. The divorce proceedings move forward with the careful choreography of 2 people who genuinely want to minimize damage. Clara and I sit across from mediators and lawyers, dividing 15 years of shared accumulation with the same efficiency we once brought to grocery lists and carpool schedules. She's been more generous than I deserve, more understanding than I had any right to expect. When I tried to apologize again last week, she stopped me with a sad smile and said she'd rather have half of who I really am than all of who I was pretending to be. The girls struggle sometimes, especially Emma, who at 12 is old enough to sense the deeper currents beneath our careful explanations about how sometimes people grow in different directions. But they're adapting, finding ways to love both their parents in this new configuration. They've even warmed to Emory, who appears in their lives gradually, carefully, as a friend of Daddy's who makes him laugh in ways they haven't heard in years. Through the window, I watch Emory arrange kindling in the fire pit we installed last weekend, his movements economical and sure. He's been staying here more often lately, his freelance work allowing him the flexibility to work from anywhere with decent internet. We're taking things slowly, learning each other again as the people we've become rather than trying to resurrect who we were 20 years ago. It's not the passionate reunion of a romantic movie. We're too old for that kind of intensity, too aware of what real love costs and what it requires to sustain. Instead, it's something quieter, more sustainable. The recognition of 2 people who fit together in ways that feel both inevitable and chosen. He's different now than he was in college, more settled in himself, less restless. Success in his field has given him a confidence that enhances rather than replaces the sensitivity that first drew me to him. He still sees beauty in unexpected places, still photographs shadows and strangers, and me when he thinks I'm not paying attention. But now there's a patience to his attention, a willingness to let moments develop naturally rather than trying to capture them before they slip away. We don't talk much about the lost years, the paths not taken, the different lives we might have lived if I'd been braver at 22. That history exists between us like a scar, visible, permanent, but no longer tender to the touch. We focus instead on building something new from the people we are now, in this place, with this hard-won understanding of what we're choosing and what we're giving up. The coffee grows cool in our mugs while I sit at the small desk I've positioned by the window, a legal pad open before me. I've been trying to write lately, not the technical documentation that pays my bills, but something more personal. Letters to my daughters, maybe, explaining things they're too young to understand now, but might need to know someday. Or journal entries, mapping the territory of this new life I'm learning to inhabit. Or maybe just words for the sake of words, the simple pleasure of putting language to experience. The page remains mostly blank, crossed through with false starts and abandoned thoughts. How do you explain the weight of choosing honesty over safety? How do you describe the strange mixture of grief and relief that comes with dismantling a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow at its core? Outside, the first snow of the season begins to fall, soft flakes drifting past the window like scattered thoughts seeking somewhere to land. Emory looks up from the fire pit and waves, his smile visible even from this distance. Later, We'll sit by that fire with blankets and wine, watching the snow accumulate on the lake's surface, talking about his next project or my daughter's upcoming winter concert or the way the light changes as the season shifts toward darkness. For now, though, I sit at this desk and let myself feel the full weight of where I am. Not happy, exactly. Happiness feels too simple a word for this complex mixture of loss and discovery. But honest, awake, living in my own skin for the first time in 15 years. The pen hovers over the blank page, waiting for words that might capture what it means to start over at 41, to choose difficult truth over comfortable fiction, to finally stop apologizing for taking up space in your own life. Outside, the snow continues to fall, patient and unhurried, covering the familiar landscape with something new.